earlier this
Hello
week.
and welcome to our ENDO 2023 Diabetes News Conference. We're really happy that you're all here today. My name is Colleen Williams and I'm the Senior Communications Manager at the Endocrine Society. Today's ENDO News Conference will focus on the latest research on diabetes, and we're really pleased to have with us Dr. Joanne Bruno of NYU Langone Health, Dr. Joseph Henske of the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, and Dr. Esther Bell-Sambataro of Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. Over the next 30 minutes, each speaker will present their findings, and then we'll end with a Q&A session. Please note that this conference is being broadcast live via webcast, and that there are many journalists online with us right now. Because we're broadcasting live, it's important for all remarks to be made into a microphone to enable those who are joining virtually to hear everyone. Journalists who are attending online, you'll be able to type your questions into the chat box at any point during the news conference, and we'll address those at the end at the Q&A. I would now like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Bruno.
All right, great. Hi, my name is Dr. Joanne Bruno, and I'm an endocrinology fellow at NYU Langone Health. And today I'm going to tell you about the work I've done in the lab of Jose Aleman, looking at early time-restricted feeding as a weight-neutral approach to improved glycemia. I'll start out just by going over a few key points of our study before getting into the nitty-gritty details of what we did. So, early time-restricted feeding is a type of intermittent fasting in which food intake is restricted to the first 6 to 8 hours of the day. Our study tests whether adherence to an early time-restricted feeding diet impacts glycemia in the absence of weight loss. In our study, we defined early time-restricted feeding as an eating window from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. with 80% of calories consumed prior to 1 p.m. We found that just 1 week of early time-restricted feeding reduces fluctuations in blood sugar levels and reduces the time that the blood sugar is elevated. These data suggest that early time-restricted feeding may be a helpful strategy for diabetes prevention. All right, so for those who are less familiar, intermittent fasting is an umbrella term to describe a variety of meal timing strategies that cycle between fasting and eating windows. It's been popularized over the past few years in both the lay and the scientific communities as a weight loss strategy. Intermittent fasting comes in a variety of different flavors, one of which is time-restricted feeding, and this is a protocol where caloric consumption is limited to a set number of consecutive hours of the day, followed by a prolonged fasting window. Early time-restricted feeding, which is what we looked at in our study, is a subset of time-restricted feeding in which the eating window is restricted to the early hours of the day. There's an increasing body of evidence that early eating behaviors, coupled with reduction or elimination of late-night eating behaviors, is important for optimizing weight loss and metabolic health outcomes. The reason that this is thought to be true is that when we align our eating windows with the more active periods of the day, we can synchronize nutrient intake with certain circadian patterns, resulting in improved weight loss outcomes, decreased cardiovascular risk, and improved diabetes outcomes. Additionally, what we know is that individuals with perpetual circadian clock disruption, such as night shift workers or those with significant late-night eating behaviors, are at increased risk for obesity and cardiometabolic disease. Taken together, these data do indicate that the timing of when we eat is important for optimizing our metabolic health. Now, while caloric restriction is not a requirement in most time-restricted feeding protocols, the reality is that many individuals who are adherent to these protocols do lose weight. The reason for this is thought to be due to the fact that shortening of the eating window results in unintentional decreases in calorie consumption. As a result, it's been difficult to tease apart whether some of the metabolic benefits that we see with these dietary strategies are merely due to weight loss, or whether there might be something inherent about these dietary strategies themselves that are causing these metabolic benefits. To get at this question, there was a study that was published in Cell Metabolism in 2018 by Sutton et al., looking at the weight-independent effects of early time-restricted feeding on metabolic disease. They compared 5 weeks of early time-restricted feeding to 5 weeks of usual feeding in 8 men with prediabetes. And what they found was that early time-restricted feeding improved insulin sensitivity, improved beta cell function, decreased blood pressure, and decreased total cholesterol levels, even in the absence of any weight loss. Again, for the first time showing that there are actually weight-independent benefits of early time-restricted feeding on metabolic health. So these results excited us to explore whether, sorry, I'm just seeing if I can get a laser. Okay, great. Whether there might be other weight-independent effects of early time-restricted feeding on glycemia and inflammation. So in our study, we compared early time-restricted feeding, which we define as an eating window from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., with 80% of calories consumed prior to 1 p.m., to usual feeding, which was really more of an ad-lib feeding pattern, meaning individuals could eat when they wanted to eat. However, they had to consume 50% of their calories after 4 p.m. Our hypothesis was that early time-restricted feeding, with this extended fasting period and this early eating window, would improve glycemia and inflammatory markers even in the absence of weight loss. Our study was a randomized 6-day isocaloric crossover supervised feeding study comparing early time-restricted feeding to usual feeding in humans with prediabetes and a BMI greater than 28, so individuals with overweight or obesity. There were 10 participants who were randomized 1-to-1 to either 1 week of an early time-restricted feeding diet or 1 week of a usual feeding diet, at which point they crossed over to the alternate arm of the study for the subsequent week. We obtained measurements at baseline, on day 7, and on day 14, and our participants wore CGMs or continuous glucose monitors for the duration of the study. Inclusion criteria were adults aged 18 to 75 with a BMI greater than 28 and prediabetes. Exclusion criteria were a BMI less than 28, a hemoglobin A1C that fell outside of the prediabetic range, HIV infection, or the use of certain medications. Now, notably, this was a weight-neutral study, and all of the food was provided for our participants to consume throughout the duration of the study. Their diets were engineered to match their home diet and food preferences, as well as to ensure that they would consume enough calories that they would maintain their weight throughout the study. Our primary endpoints were change in glycemic variation or fluctuation of blood sugar levels, which we measured looking at a parameter called the mean amplitude of glycemic excursion, as well as change in inflammatory plasma marker concentrations in the time-restricted feeding arm relative to the control arm. I'm going to focus on this first endpoint for the purpose of this talk today, but I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions about the secondary endpoint. This is a table showing the baseline characteristics of the enrolled subjects. It's displayed both as the overall data from all participants, as well as divided up into those who started out the study in the usual feeding arm and those who started out in the early time-restricted feeding arm. And the real take-home here is that there were no significant differences between the two arms in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, BMI, hemoglobin A1C, or baseline high-sensitivity CRP levels, which is an inflammatory marker. As I mentioned, our participants wore continuous glucose monitors throughout the study, and when we analyzed the continuous glucose monitor data, what we found was that on the early time-restricted feeding arm, individuals had significantly less fluctuation of their blood sugar levels compared to the time they spent on the usual feeding arm. And again, we measured this using a parameter called the mean amplitude of glycemic excursion. There were no differences in the average glucose levels or in the standard deviation of the glucose levels between the two arms. The typical metrics that a continuous glucose monitor usually reports to its users are the time above range, which is defined as a blood sugar greater than 180, the time in range, which is defined as a blood sugar between 70 to 180, and the time below range, which is defined as a blood sugar less than 70. And we didn't see any differences in any of these metrics between our two arms. However, what's important to keep in mind is that continuous glucose monitors are typically worn by individuals with diabetes who have higher blood sugar levels than our participants who have prediabetes. So we decided to look at the lower hyperglycemic range, the 140 to 180 blood sugar range, to see if there were any differences between the two arms. And indeed, what we found was that on the early time-restricted feeding arm, our participants spent significantly less time in this hyperglycemic blood sugar range of 140 to 180 compared to the time when they were on the usual feeding arm. So what does this mean in terms of day-to-day blood sugar levels? So here I'm showing representative continuous glucose monitor tracings from two of our subjects from the time they spent on the usual feeding arm and the early time-restricted feeding arm. Time is on the x-axis, blood sugar level is on the y-axis. And what you can see is that on the usual feeding arm, our subjects had more fluctuation of their blood sugar levels, as well as more time spent in this hyperglycemic range of the blood sugar greater than 140, shown in yellow, compared to the time they spent on the early time restricted feeding arm, where the curves are much flatter with little or no time spent in this hyperglycemic blood sugar range. So in conclusion, early time restricted feeding improves glycemia by reducing blood sugar fluctuation as well as the time that the blood sugar is elevated above normal levels. These effects are independent of weight loss. And based on these data, early time restricted feeding may be a helpful dietary strategy for diabetes prevention in at-risk individuals, including those with obesity or prediabetes. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. I'd like to thank my colleagues in the lab, as well as our collaborators at Rockefeller University, without whom the execution of this study could not have been done, and our colleagues at NYU who have helped with data analysis and study design. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bruno. I'd now like to invite Dr. Henske to speak.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the Endocrine Society for giving me the opportunity to share our results of a real-world survey of adherence to guidelines regarding type 1 diabetes and aerobic exercise. I have no disclosures for this. The background is that despite the fact that we have had many advances in type 1 diabetes therapies, including advanced formulations of insulin, insulin pumps, continuous glucose monitors, controlling blood sugars during exercise remains quite a challenge. There's frequent hypoglycemic events related to exercise, as well as unpredictable hyperglycemia or high blood sugars. There are expert consensus statements regarding how to manage blood glucose levels during exercise. However, it's unclear how widely adopted these recommendations are. I've listed a few of the most important papers on this topic here, and you can have these in your references. So what we did was we wanted to get, again, a real-world analysis. So we developed a 96-question online anonymized survey using REDCap, which is the Research Electronic Data Capture tool developed at Vanderbilt. And we identified a target audience of individuals who have type 1 diabetes who are athletes. We posted this survey link to active social media groups for people who exercise, the type 1, specifically the type 1 run community, the diabetic ultra endurance athlete community, and type 1 diabetic athletes. We divided our survey into 9 sections. We include background demographics, a medical history of their diabetes and complications, their frequency of use of diabetes technology, their experience with exercise, their emotional feelings surrounding their use of exercise, exercise safety, which is one of the most important areas that we're reporting today, as well as how they manage their diabetes before exercise, during their exercise, and after their exercise. It's important to understand the demographics. Anytime you're doing a survey, you want to understand what is the population that you've really captured in this survey. So we received 102 completed surveys from adults with type 1 diabetes. And again, this was a pretty extensive survey. It took about 20 to 30 minutes to complete fully. The average duration of diabetes for the participants was 20 years, and their average self-reported hemoglobin A1C was 7.1%. The mean age was 42 years, ranging from 18 to 70. And it was predominantly female, 69% female, 94% Caucasian, and 78% of participants were from the US. Again, this was posted to online groups, so it was available to anyone in those groups. 68% of the respondents performed aerobic exercise at least 4 days per week. This is an average of 23 miles of exercise per week, either walking, jogging, or running. We specifically isolated those specific activities of aerobic activity, because the glucose profile with aerobic activity tends to cause more hypoglycemia versus anaerobic activity, things that are intense, CrossFit, weightlifting, things like that would cause high blood sugars, and we wanted to isolate this variable. So to understand the demographics in summary, this is a very experienced group of athletes or people who engage in exercise with more than 20 years of having diabetes. They're very well controlled overall with an average hemoglobin A1C of 7.1%, and they're very engaged in their sport. This is not just someone off the street. What's very important to understand also is that the people in this survey were using all the available current technology to manage their diabetes. 97% of respondents were wearing continuous glucose monitors, 75% were wearing insulin pumps, and of those who are wearing insulin pumps, 76% of them were wearing what's called an advanced hybrid closed-loop insulin pump, which can automatically adjust the insulin delivery to achieve a designated target range. So to really get to the heart of what this is showing, I think we asked this really important question. Where did you learn the most about managing your diabetes during exercise? And what we found is that the majority of people receive their information not from their medical team, but from other sources. 80% of people said that the majority of their information they learned through simple trial and error on their own. A lower percentage, but still significant, 46%, learned it from their social media groups and their social media followings and the people that are that they've talked to online. Only a little bit more than 30% actually learned from their medical team, their physicians, their nurses, their nurse practitioners. Almost equivalent was 28% learning from online searches like Google, such as how do you exercise with diabetes? And about 8% reported learning the majority of their information via YouTube or online videos. In this population, the primary concern is preventing hypoglycemia. 27% of respondents reported having a fear of hypoglycemia as the major reason that they don't exercise more frequently. 36% reported increased glucose variability or glucose fluctuations as a result of their exercise. And the more glucose fluctuations that one has, the higher risk of low blood sugars and hypoglycemia. 86% of respondents had to stop their exercise at some point due to hypoglycemia. 18% actually had a severe hypoglycemic event, which required assistance from another person during their exercise. And 41% reported difficulty with hypoglycemia or low blood sugars after exercise. What we find is that the more hypoglycemia you have, the more hypoglycemia continues to occur. It becomes recurrent, and you develop what's called hypoglycemia unawareness. 19% said that they have an actual diagnosis of hypoglycemia unawareness as a result. When we actually asked them what their blood sugars were when they started feeling symptoms of hypoglycemia, in fact, though, there were many more people who had inappropriate sensation of hypoglycemia. Only 11% felt symptoms of hypoglycemia appropriately with a blood sugar above 70. 40% started to feel symptoms between 60 and 70, 26% between 50 and 60, 21% when a blood sugar was under 50. And just to remind you, what's considered severe hypoglycemia would be a blood sugar value under 55. 3% of people reported never having symptoms of hypoglycemia, regardless of their glucose level. So a key element of this is that we're showing that many people learn about managing diabetes and exercise not from the guidelines. So what we're looking at is how do the guidelines differ than what people are actually doing? So if you look at these four aspects here of some of the guidelines, you see that the guideline would say that if severe hypoglycemia occurs, you should not exercise for 24 hours to allow your body to sort of reset your response to hypoglycemia, your body's natural response. Yet 73% of our respondents said that they would, and they do, continue to exercise despite experiencing severe hypoglycemia within the last 24 hours. The guidelines would suggest that you should check for the presence of ketones if you have unexplained hyperglycemia to make sure that you're not in diabetic ketoacidosis. Yet 74% of respondents do not check for ketones if they have unexplained hyperglycemia. The guidelines suggest that you should not exercise if elevated ketones are present. 11% reported that they do exercise with ketones present, and perhaps the same individuals, 10% reported actually going on to develop diabetic ketoacidosis during exercise. A guideline would suggest that you should wear diabetes identification during exercise so that people know that you have diabetes in case you have a medical problem, yet 49% of people report not wearing diabetes identification during exercise. So what should we do with this information? I want to get this out so that people understand the extent of the challenges that we face with diabetes and exercise. And I want to communicate not only this information about the safety of exercise in diabetes, but also some further steps that we uncovered during this survey about how people manage their diabetes before, during, and after exercise, which we can include in a future publication. We want to increase awareness of the current guidelines because clearly this is a problem. If we're not aware of the guidelines, it's very difficult to adhere to them. And this should be disseminated to primary care providers, diabetes specialists, and endocrinologists, as well as directly to patients. And then we need to look at how exercise can be made safer in type 1 diabetes overall through advances in diabetes technology, through better pumps, better sensors, better systems, advances in the nutritional components, how do we take in carbohydrates during exercise to prevent hypoglycemia, as well as the use of counter-regulatory hormones as well, such as glucagon, to counter the hypoglycemic risk during exercise. So in conclusion, many people with type 1 diabetes are using resources outside of their healthcare team for help when exercising. And hypoglycemia unawareness and hypoglycemia management are significant concerns for athletes with type 1 diabetes. I think we need to increase our utilization of implementation science and developing educational tools to increase awareness of these current guidelines surrounding type 1 diabetes and exercise in order to improve outcomes. Thank you.
All right, I'd now like to invite Dr. Bell Sambataro to present.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Esther Bell Sambataro, and I am a second-year endocrinology fellow at Nationwide Children's Hospital. Thank you for this invitation to present on our research, which is entitled Proportion of Type 2 Diabetes Amongst New Diabetes Diagnoses in Youth, which continues to increase 12 months after the pandemic. These are our disclosures. So just a little bit of background. Type 1 diabetes, or autoimmune diabetes, is the most common form of diabetes in pediatric populations aged less than 18. Type 2 diabetes was historically thought of as adult-onset diabetes due to its relationship with lifestyle and increased body weight. Rising rates of both obesity and type 2 diabetes mellitus have been noted among youth in the past few decades, and this has been an alarming trend that we have been seeing. On March 11th, 2020, as we all know, COVID-19 was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. Several single-institution studies have been showing there was an increased incidence of type 1 diabetes during the COVID-19 pandemic. Similar studies and some multi-institutional studies have shown a significant increase in frequency of type 2 diabetes in youth during the first 12 months of the COVID pandemic. Increased rates of type 2 diabetes were attributed to environmental changes during the pandemic, which included lockdowns, school closures, increased stressors, decreased physical activity, increased food consumption, increased weight gain, and worsening insulin resistance in at-risk adolescents. The role of a preceding COVID-19 infection in diabetes pathophysiology is still unclear. The rapid increase in these new diabetes diagnoses overwhelmed the pediatric diabetes healthcare system, and it was unclear if this increase in cases had persisted beyond the first year of pandemic, once some of these things, such as the school closures, were no longer in effect. Our hypothesis was that the frequency of type 2 diabetes and the proportion of type 2 diabetes amongst all youth with new onset diabetes would decrease to pre-pandemic levels a year after the pandemic was declared, and once youth returned back to school and back to what would be considered their normal. Therefore, we conducted a retrospective chart review from March 1st, 2018 through February 28th, 2022. We included all patients less than 18 years old diagnosed with type 1 or type 2 diabetes at our institution. We excluded anyone over 18, anyone with a diagnosis other than type 1 or type 2 diabetes, and those diagnosed at another institution and transferring care to us. We also excluded anyone diagnosed outside of our study timeframe. And so we reviewed charts for 4 years. The way we did this was year 1 and year 2 were considered prior to the pandemic. Then the COVID-19 pandemic, as can be seen visually, was after February of 2020. And then year 3 and year 4 were during the COVID-19 pandemic. Patient characteristics and anthropometric data at diagnosis were collected, and descriptive categorical data was reported as frequency and proportion. Non-normally distributed data were expressed as median and 25th to 75th percentile. ANOVA was used as appropriate, and Bonferroni adjustment was made to control for multiple comparisons from year to year. And so this brings us to our results. So this is our table 1, which shows clinical characteristics of youth and new diagnosis of type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. So these are all new onset diabetes. The total number of diabetes diagnoses increased over time, where year 1 we saw 254 youth. In year 2, that decreased to 238. In year 3, our total new onset diabetes increased to 339. That was the first year of pandemic. And our second year of pandemic, our diabetes diagnosis continued to increase to 392 youth. There was not a significant difference in gender, ethnicity, primary insurance type, DKA at presentation, age at diagnosis, or hemoglobin A1C at diagnosis. There was, however, a significant difference in race from year 2 to year 3, as well as year 2 compared to year 4, so pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, with an increase in all new onset diabetes amongst Black youth. The proportion of type 2 diabetes, however, was what was most significant amongst all new onset diabetes. And this is a graph that pictorially depicts that increase, with new onset type 2 diabetes being in orange and new onset type 1 diabetes in blue. So as you can see, prior to the pandemic, we had anywhere between 19 to 25% of new onset diabetes being type 2 diabetes, which that increased significantly during the pandemic to 31% in the first year and 33% in the second year. Another clinical characteristic that we wanted to highlight was that obesity among all youth with new onset diabetes also increased significantly. So on the left side, you can see BMI Z-score. BMI Z-scores for all new onset diabetes amongst patients, and you can see that was increasing year by year. We also can see that there was an increase in the number of youth with obesity, which is seen in that with the black line. For youth with the new onset type 1 diabetes, so this is our clinical characteristics for just new onset type 1s, there was really no statistical significance across years in gender, race, ethnicity, primary insurance, presence or severity of DKA at diagnosis, age, or hemoglobin A1C at diagnosis. However, we continued to see the same trend where BMI Z-scores increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. So year 1, we actually see that The patient's Z-scores for BMI were actually below the 0, so the mean, and now those have started to increase above the mean year by year. For youth diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, there was not a significant difference in gender, ethnicity, primary insurance, DKA at diagnosis, or age at diagnosis. There was, however, an increase in Black youth with new onset type 2 diabetes, which increased during the pandemic. However, after we did our Bonferroni adjustments for the multiple comparisons, it did not reach statistical significance. It was approaching it with a p-value of 0.057. However, it did not actually show a true significant difference. But the main difference we saw was in year 1, prior to the pandemic, comparing it to year 3, the first year of the pandemic, where Black youth increased from 27% to 47%, a very large representation amongst new onset type 2 diabetes. The BMI among youth with new onset type 2 diabetes diagnosis, interestingly, decreased significantly during the first year of the pandemic from the prior year. And we can see that on the left-hand side, where we always had an elevated BMI Z-score in that year 3, that first year of pandemic, that decreased significantly. However, in year 4, once everything reopened, schools were back in session, we actually saw that that level rose once again. And hemoglobin A1C for new onset type 2 diabetes rose significantly during the first year of the pandemic. And that was seen by an average A1C of 7.8% the year prior to the pandemic, and now we saw an increase to A1C of 10.1% during the first year of pandemic. That level continued to stay quite stable in the second year of pandemic as well. And so, as shown, there was an increase in proportion of youth diagnosed with type 2 diabetes amongst all new onset diabetes diagnoses, which has persisted beyond that first year of COVID-19 pandemic, even once schools reopened and youth returned to their usual lifestyles. In youth with type 2 diabetes diagnosis, the BMI Z-scores at diagnosis decreased significantly from the prior year at the beginning of the pandemic. The reason for this is still unclear. However, in the second year of the pandemic, they rose once again to similar numbers from before. In youth with type 1 diabetes, the BMI Z-scores increased significantly from year 1 to year 4, a change which may be related to the pandemic-era lifestyle changes and restrictions seen. The hemoglobin A1C for youth with new onset type 2 diabetes changed significantly in the first year of the pandemic, which could be indicative of a delay in seeking care early on in the first year of pandemic. As we all know, many families were really concerned about going to see medical providers during that first year of pandemic, and often there were no availability of appointments at that time. Therefore, even though we have returned to pre-pandemic times in several aspects, the increased risk for at-risk youth developing type 2 diabetes, which started during the pandemic, has persisted beyond this first year. This indicates the increase in type 1 and type 2 diabetes diagnosis may not be due to just pandemic-era restrictions and lifestyle changes. We must continue to monitor our at-risk youth and have a low threshold to screen for type 2 diabetes in those with genetic risk factors, obesity, and less active lifestyles. The rapid change in the landscape of pediatric diabetes with growing numbers of youth with type 2 diabetes is very alarming, and it requires further investigation with longitudinal and multi-center studies. I would like to thank our team, as well as our biostatisticians at OSU, and you can feel free to send any further questions to my email. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Jenny now to kick off the Q&A. Any questions in the room?
Hi, this is Ed Sussman with MedPage today. Dr. Hensky, can you speculate as to why patients are not getting their information at their doctor's clinics? Is it is it because the doctors don't have enough time, or is it because the patients aren't asking the right questions?
I think that's a good question. I think there's probably a little bit of a lot of factors. I think that we've all evolved to this embracing social media to some extent, and I think that the amount of information that's out there on the internet and the facility at which we all feel like we can attain that information and interact with that information is becoming ever easier. And I think the level of comfort that people have and the level of confidence or perhaps overconfidence in the accuracy of that information is something to keep an eye on. I think oftentimes people feel that the information that they can get from online sources is just as good, if not better, than their own doctors. And that can be a problem, as we've seen. So I think that, that's one factor. But I think that what you mentioned about the pressures of a doctor's visit and the time is significant. Managing diabetes, there's a lot of things that we need to take care of at a visit. We need to look at the blood sugars. We need to adjust the insulin. How we manage diabetes with exercise is a nuanced element of that. And perhaps patients don't feel that the doctor does have enough time to address that more specifically. It's very, very important, but again, that tends to be something that maybe not as much time gets devoted to that at the visit.
And I have a question for Dr. Bruno. How sustainable is this program? I mean, this was like a laboratory rat study with humans, and my biggest concern is, what do you do from the period from 4 p.m. till you go to sleep when you're doing things like watching TV or going to the movies or walking around the park? How do you keep from ingesting whatever's around because you're hungry?
Sure. So, there have been multiple real-world studies looking at time-restricted feeding, not specifically early time-restricted feeding, that have demonstrated feasibility of some of these protocols in the real world. Certainly more real-world studies need to be done looking at early time-restricted feeding. Ours was a very short study, just 1 week, and a very highly controlled study. However, we did give our subjects surveys, both at baseline and then after their experience on each of the 2 arms, assessing hunger, satiety, and fullness, and their impression of each of those parameters over the past week. And there were no significant differences between from baseline to any of the 2 weeks or between the 2 weeks of the study. So I do think that it is possible for people to do this in the real world. Again, more work needs to be done to see if there are any tweaks we would need to make in the real world and how these tweaks might affect the metabolic response, whether maybe doing it for a portion of the week can be helpful or the whole week. I think we just need more work to really investigate this. However, it is promising that our subjects did feel that they weren't especially hungry after the early time restricted feeding diet, and they were very satisfied with the meals that they did receive.
Would there be a problem in doing sort of like from 9 to 5 or 10 to 6?
Right. I mean, that's always the question of comparing these studies to the real world. How far can we go? How far can we push, the changes that we make before our data becomes irrelevant? And we see this with studies all the time. We would need to do the study. I have no way of knowing that for sure.
Great, and we have some questions from the live stream. From Mitchell Zoller with Medscape. This is for Dr. Henske. Could you please detail perhaps a couple of interventions that you think should be done soon to get out the message about how to safely exercise with type 1 diabetes?
I think that individuals who have type 1 diabetes should go to their doctors and seek their advice primarily from their doctors. Their doctors have the resources, they have the guidelines, they have the context and the understanding to know what's safe and what's not safe and why it's safe and the rationale for doing these things. And so I think making that clear, I think, is very important. And so I think that's the first step. And then I think that beyond that, again, when it comes to advancing technologic innovations and things like that, those will come over time.
Great, thank you. For Dr. Bell-Sambataro, do you see this trend of increased type 2 cases among youth continuing? Is this something you're continuing to monitor now that we're sort of out of the emergency phase of the pandemic?
Yeah, great question. Yes, so as we mentioned and we alluded to, we've already seen an increase in obesity in youth over time for the past few decades. And so we know that obesity and we know that decreased physical activity are risk factors for type 2 diabetes. And so we are going to continue to monitor this trend and see if this continues to rise. However, I think our main focus needs to be now on how to prevent the progression and the development of type 2 diabetes by decreasing obesity and really trying to work with our youth in that sense.
Great, thank you. Dr. Bruno, I have a question from Mitchell Zoller from Medscape. You mentioned that the diet was kept weight neutral. Does this involve equal caloric intake, or does that vary by time of eating? In other words, if the same calories are taken throughout the day or with time restriction, are the weight effects the same?
So our subjects ate the same number of calories and during the time that they were on the same number of daily calories during the time that they were on the early time restricted feeding diet and the usual feeding diet. I think the general consensus is that, caloric consumption and weight loss are based on a calorie deficit over a period of days, weeks, however you want to calculate it. But the total amount of calories, let's say in a day, is what is really probably important. And so our participants ate the same number of daily calories, whether they were on the early time restricted feeding versus the usual feeding diet.
Great, thank you.
Hi, this is Ed Sussman with MedPage Today again for Dr. Bell-Sambataro. Your hypothesis was that the type 2 diabetes would return to the pre-pandemic levels afterwards, and you did not find that. Does this indicate that there's something else going on with the pandemic that may have impacted routines and a whole bunch of other stuff?
Yes, absolutely. So that's one of the reasons why our hypothesis was that we would return to what was pre-pandemic, because of the fact that during the pandemic we did see quite a bit of really decreased physical activity. Kids were out of school, they were out of their routines, things that typically they would be provided with food at school, oftentimes breakfast and lunch, or meals that they have at school, which now are being provided at home and may not be as nutritious or well balanced. And so we expected that once they returned back to school, things would normalize, which is not what we found, as you mentioned. But we do find that that there is something else that is causing this increase in type 2 diabetes, and we just need further studies to figure out what other things are contributing, including COVID-19. At this time, we don't know that there is a true contribution to the pathophysiology, but that is something that we'll need to continue to study.
Great, that's all the questions we have in the queue.
Thank you again to all of our speakers and journalists that joined us today. As a reminder, the recordings of these news conferences will be available on our website and YouTube channel. And if you have any additional questions or would like to set up an interview, please contact us at media@endocrine.org. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.